Tonight with sad news. Jim Lehrer, our founding co-anchor, died this morning. We are heartbroken here at the NewsHour. Jim's remarkable legacy of journalism is with us every day. We want to send our love and deepest condolences to Kate, Jim's wife, his 3 daughters, and their grandchildren. We'll look back at Jim's life and talk with Robert MacNeil, with Sharon Rockefeller, and Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer later in the program. This program actually got its start when Jim and Robin anchored coverage of the Watergate hearings gavel to gavel in this very studio. We know that Jim would want us to honor him by continuing to do our work, and we lead with the impeachment trial. Nick Schiffer. There's no way to quantify Jim Lehrer's influence on this program, on American journalism, on presidential debates, and on the lives of so many of us. Jeffrey Brown begins with a look back at Jim's life and the extraordinary stories he told with his unique voice.
Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer. On the NewsHour this Wednesday, it was another heavy day of news on the Middle East.
Jim Lehrer always told those of us privileged to work with him, it's not about us. But night after night, Jim showed by example that being yourself, journalist, writer, family man, citizen, can be a high calling indeed. For 36 years as an anchor of the NewsHour, Jim reported the news.
People often ask me if there are guidelines in our practice of what I like to call MacNeil-Lehrer journalism. Well, yes, there are.
He did it with a clear sense of purpose, even as the world of media changed around him.
Do nothing I cannot defend. Cover, write, and present every story with the care I would want if the story were about me. Assume there is at least one other side or version to every story. Assume the viewer is as smart and as caring and as good a person as I am. Assume the same about all people on whom I report. Assume personal lives are a private matter until a legitimate turn in the story absolutely mandates otherwise. Carefully separate opinion and analysis from straight news stories and clearly label everything. Do not use anonymous sources or blind quotes except on rare and monumental occasions. No one should ever be allowed to attack another anonymously. And finally, I am not in the entertainment business.
Jim Lehrer was born in 1934 in Wichita, Kansas, the son of Lois, a bank clerk, and Harry, a bus station manager. He attended Victoria College in Texas and then studied journalism at the University of Missouri. His father and brother before him enlisted in the Marines, and Jim served 3 years as an infantry officer in the late 50s, including time in the Pacific. He saw no combat, but spoke often of how the experience shaped him, including at a 2010 parade the Corps put on in his honor.
Seldom a day goes by that I don't know that I am doing something because of something I learned in the Marine Corps. And I only have one favor to ask of all of you here tonight, particularly all of you Marines. Forget all that civilian stuff for the next hour or two, and do your best to think of me only not as an old man in a dark blue suit with a red tie, but think of me as Lehrer, James C., First Lieutenant, USMC, serial number 071278, MOS 0302, Infantry, Executive Officer, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 3rd Marine Division. Thank you, and Semper Fidelis.
In 1960, Jim married his lifelong partner and love, Kate Staples. He also began his journalism career in earnest, joining the Dallas Morning News and then the Dallas Times-Herald, reporting on local politics and serving as city editor. He covered his first history-making story, the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas in 1963. Jim and Robert MacNeil, who covered the assassination for NBC News, spoke of it on the NewsHour in 2014.
And it was disbelief. What I
took away and have taken away, and it still overrides everything that I have done in journalism since. What the Kennedy assassination did for me was forever keep me aware of the fragility of everything. That at any given moment, something could happen. I mean, my God, if they could shoot the president. And when I later became city editor of that same newspaper, I had a rule that every phone that rang in that newsroom got answered, because you never knew who was on the other line.
Either one of you school board members want to comment on that recommendation?
Jim's television career was also launched in Dallas at public station KERA.
I'm Jim Lehrer, and this is Newsroom, a program of local news, analysis, and opinion. But Irvin and Baker aren't the only...
His move to the national stage with PBS came as a correspondent for what was then called the National Public Affairs Center for Television, or NPACT. It was there he first joined MacNeil to cover another watershed moment.
From Washington, NPAC brings you gavel-to-gavel videotape coverage of today's hearings by the Senate.
In 1973, the new MacNeil-Lehrer team broadcast the Senate Watergate hearings live, and then presented a rebroadcast with analysis late into the night, some 250 hours in all.
So unless those tapes are made public or some other revelation comes our way, the senators, as well as the rest of us who are interested, may have to eventually make an ultimate choice between believing John Dean or Bob Haldeman. That's the way it looks to me, at least, at 3 or so in the morning. Feel free to disagree.
Jim and Robin talked with me about it on the 40th anniversary.
Remember, we broadcasted it live during the daytime as it happened, and then we completely repeated it gavel to gavel. So it was a double hit there, and that was a huge commitment for public broadcasting to make. And the reason they made it was because this premise that the presidency of the United States was at stake.
Some 70,000 letters poured in praising the team and its work. Jim, in his own words, picks up the story of what happened next.
We began life in October 1975 as the Robert MacNeil Report.
Good evening. New York's Governor Hugh Carey said today,
and months later became the MacNeil-Lehrer Report.
Jim?
Robin, there used to be just two basic ways to buy a house.
In those days, we dealt with one story for half an hour.
Expanded from the present half hour to a comprehensive one-hour program of news.
That transition to the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour happened in 1983.
Good evening. Yes, said the Soviet Union, we shot down that Korean airliner, but we didn't know it was a civilian plane, and it was completely justified.
12 years later, Robin MacNeil retired, and we became the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer.
Over the years, Jim interviewed numerous leading figures on the world stage, including Margaret Thatcher and Yasser Arafat in the 1980s, South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and Chinese leader Jiang Zemin in the 90s, Jordan's King Abdullah and Afghan President Hamid Karzai in the 2000s.
On the NewsHour tonight, the global financial storm.
He daily examined major turning points in the nation's life.
Where did the money originally?
He pressed experts from the business world,
just simply a propaganda move,
and military brass.
Recent opinion polls rank the tomato among the least loved of all vegetables.
On occasion, he turned to the unconventional to explain issues.
You've heard it.
Most notably, of course, he interviewed American political figures.
The news of this day is that Kenneth Starr, the independent counsel, is investigating allegations that you suborned perjury by encouraging a 24-year-old woman, former White House intern, to lie under oath in a civil deposition about her having had an affair with you. Mr. President, is that true?
That is not true. That is not true. I did not ask anyone to tell anything other than the truth. There is no improper relationship, and I intend to cooperate with this inquiry. But that is not true.
Another day of infamy for the United States of America.
He was calm and careful in moments of crisis.
President Bush issued an ultimatum to President Saddam Hussein of Iraq tonight. Leave power and your country in 48 hours or face military action.
Robert MacNeil said this of his longtime friend and partner.
Jim's intelligence is so laser-like, no matter what he's applying it to.
A snowflake.
In interviewing,
Terminology that you
I learned a lot from him, because I'd sort of come out of the school of an interviewer carrying on like the Secretary of State in waiting. Well, Mr. Secretary, we all know that the situation with the Russians in Lower Moldova has been intolerable for a long time, and that U.S. policy has been, ever since Senate Resolution 304, that we should do la la la. So what are you going to do about it? Or something like that. And Jim always cuts through all that crap and says, what are you going to do about this? Or what does this mean? Or I don't understand, explain to me. And I learned a lot from his manner of very direct interview, and not being afraid to say you don't understand or you don't know.
Perhaps nowhere was this seen better than on the largest stage of all, with upwards of 60 million viewers, as moderator of 12 presidential debates, more than any other person in U.S. history. His first in 1988, his last 2012. And in 1996 and 2000, he moderated all the presidential debates, the first to do that.
What are you going to have to give up in terms of the priorities that you would bring as President of the United States?
For Americans, Jim would say, the debates are the one chance to take the measure of candidates side by side. And the stakes are incredibly high.
None of us has any idea what Jim Lehrer intends to ask.
One person who usually did know what Lehrer would ask was his wife, Kate, who served as his main debate preparation sounding board. In 2012, she shared what that was like.
As soon as this process really gets underway, it's sliding in the, I'm Alice in Wonderland going in the rabbit hole. Praying to come out on the other side.
It's safe to say this is pretty nerve-wracking.
It's very nerve-wracking. It's just fairly surreal.
Debate in 2004 between...
The occasion for our talk was Jim's book, Tension City, a reflection on his role in presidential debates, what he called walking down the blade of a knife.
It's not a lot of fun, but if you get to the other end, it's really exciting.
You've made it.
You've made it.
Thank you, Senators, both.
When the debate is over that I moderate, I want everybody to say, okay, here you have seen and heard the candidates for President of the United States on the same stage at the same time, talking about the same things, and you can judge them. I mean, do you like this guy? Is this person really, you know, is he telling the truth? All that kind of stuff. Well, you can't, and you see them right there together. It's a huge test. Cast iron toys. So my collecting is kind of a mix.
But it wasn't all tension and worldly affairs. One great passion on display in his basement at home and his office at work, the intercity bus memorabilia Jim collected over the years, a reminder of his father's career and his own early Kansas childhood.
As my brother says, we kind of have diesel smoke in us.
Over the years, Jim would delight many a crowd with his bus call.
May I have your attention, please? This is your last call for Continental Trailways, 8:10 p.m., Silverside's air-conditioned through liner to Houston.
There was also Jim Lehrer, the prolific writer, author of some 20 novels, drawing on his life as a newsman, his interest in history, politics, and yes, buses. He also wrote plays and 3 memoirs.
I write a little bit on my fiction every day. It's just what I do. And yes, I have my day job. I do that too, but I do both things every day.
Jim Lehrer.
Jim earned dozens of journalism awards and honorary degrees.
Jim Lehrer is a modern man of letters who has left us a gift of professionalism and civility.
He was given the National Humanities Medal by President Clinton, elected as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and with Robert MacNeil inducted into the Television Hall of Fame. Although he insisted on not being the center of attention when reporting the news, at one important juncture in his life, Jim did tell a deeply personal story of the major heart attack that almost killed him in 1983.
Mr. Lehrer, you just had a heart attack.
The documentary, My Heart, Your Heart, captured how the scare led to a change in diet and lifestyle. Among other things, he would become a committed afternoon napper. There was no disturbing Jim between 1 and 2 o'clock. One priority never changed: his family. Jim and Kate, herself the author of 3 novels, had 3 daughters, Jamie, Lucy, and Amanda, and 6 grandchildren. Jim Lehrer stepped down as full-time anchor of the NewsHour in 2011. Late in his tenure, he closed a speech to PBS station managers this way.
We really are the fortunate ones in the current tumultuous world of journalism right now. When we wake up in the morning, we only have to decide what the news is and how we're going to cover it. We never have to decide who we are and why we are there. That is the way it has been for these nearly 35 years, and that's the way it will be forever. And for the NewsHour, there will always be a forever. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
On this day he died, we want to take some time for personal memories of Jim as a journalist, a writer, collaborator, and friend. Robert MacNeil, of course, is the co-founder of this program with Jim and his longtime friend and former co-anchor. He joins us from New York. Sharon Percy Rockefeller is the president and CEO of WETA, the public television station we're broadcasting from. Her work with Jim and Robin goes back to the very earliest days when they covered the Watergate hearings. And Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is a longtime friend of Jim's, and we welcome all of you. We know it's hard on this day. It's hard for all of us, and so we especially appreciate your being here. Robin, take us back to the early days when you and Jim first got to know each other. He came from his newspapering in Texas, and you came from your background in network television news to work together. Tell us about that.
Well, it was amazing how quickly, within a day or two, we became friends. Then we discovered we each had a tiny daughter in the same kindergarten in Bethesda, and that friendship grew so intimately and quickly that it was rather astonishing. It grew to the point where within a year or so, we put it in our wills that if anything happened to either of us, the other would look after the little children. Well, time moved on and we didn't need to observe that. But Jim was just instant friendship, and our backgrounds were so different, but they melded in a very curious way. And I remember very well in his beaten-up old Volkswagen driving back from the Watergate hearings every night, and each of us turning to the other and saying, "Can you believe we're getting paid to do this?" Anyway, he was. And as I said earlier, Jim taught me a lot. I grew up in a television background where you kind of loaded up your questions with enough information on foreign affairs as though you were a Secretary of State in waiting. And Jim just said, well, tell me about it, or why doesn't it work, or what does that mean? And wasn't afraid to ask very simple questions. I learned a lot from him.
And Robin, what was it about his journalism? I mean, for people, there's folks, younger generation today who maybe didn't see a lot of Jim or know a lot of Jim. What was it about his journalism?
Well, I think he came, as I did, from a generation where the role, if you were going to be a serious journalist, if not over-serious journalist, where you paid respect to the facts and respect for the institutions that you were covering, whether you disagreed with the way they were being run or not, and respect for the people who gave their lives to government service and the armed forces and everything else. That has changed enormously, and I think Jim was a kind of personification in the way he observed these values in his journalism of so many things that are being mocked or trashed today in our current political and journalistic situation, that he is truly of another generation.
It does feel like a different time. But Sharon, you got to know Jim and Robin, in the 1970s when they were working on the Watergate hearings. What was it about the team and about Jim?
Well, I was asked, luckily, to go on the WTA Board of Trustees. I lived in West Virginia at the time, but the founder of WTA called me and said, "We need you." And I hadn't met her. I didn't know anything about it, but she said, "Come immediately." The Watergate hearings were just starting, and we had a community board which didn't know that much about politics. My dad had been a Republican, my husband a Democrat, so they thought I knew something about politics. Well, I did, but I didn't know anything about presidential impeachment hearings. And so it was the very early days when no one knew where it was going. And I don't think Robin was in Washington that time, but I talked to Jim, and both of them over the years. We got to be good friends because we believed in the same mission. We knew this was utterly important. The newspapers were doing a good job, but people were watching television, and they were riveted. They were hooked. As it was unfolding, history was being made, and we didn't have a clue what was going to happen the next day. We aligned ourselves as a team, and we saw that our place in the world of journalism was important, and we were going to do it right and get it right, and I would figure out how to pay for it.
And those are things we still believe today.
Right.
What was it about Jim Lehrer, though, that you saw in this team in the beginning?
Well, he loved Washington. He knew a lot about Washington. We were both very directly spoken people. I'm pretty quick with words, and Jim was quick with words, so we sort of get to the point fast. We always just got along because we believed in the same values.
Justice Breyer, you've known Jim Lehrer as a friend. I mean, he obviously was covering you over the years. Tell us about your friendship.
He was a good friend. I was thinking today, what is it about him? I mean, you've said he was a Marine, and he was, and you saw it. I mean, he was definite, he was strong, he was patriotic. He was a builder, you've said that. He built this organization, and I think around a central idea, which is so much him. And the central idea is what other people say, not what the newscaster says. Right. And our job will be to bring out from them of different points of view what they're thinking. And he stuck to that, and you have. And I think that was the thing. He was interested in everything. I mean, he was interested. Did you know that when he was young, in fact, he memorized all the train schedules from Kansas?
Well, we used to hear him recite some of them.
Yes.
Right. And the bus schedules.
The bus schedules, the train schedules. He wrote mystery stories.
That's right.
He was interested in everything and everybody. And you would draw him very easily into a conversation about anything at all. He did not say, this is about me. You say?
Right.
Always. It was about something else that drew him out. And he had a comic side. I mean, it was a kind of subtle When we were in Italy one time, we were visiting some friends, and he was very late, he and Kate. And said, well, he said, I was caught in Bologna riding up and down the escalators, and I couldn't figure out how to get off the escalator. Now, we didn't know. He said, was that something he made up? He was a kind person. He was a generous person. Joanna, my wife, wrote a book about her profession, which is working with very sick children. And she was going to appear on television. And she didn't like public speaking. He spent time, rehearsed her, and said, be natural, normal, and above all, appear as if you've never been rehearsed.
And Sharon, you, having known Jim all these years, you know his family, you know his humor. You've watched him in action, great with people, with friends.
Absolutely, in every way. Starting with his wife, Kate, a wonderful novelist. They had a terrific partnership, 3 daughters. But when they were together, you could tell they were a very happy couple and devoted to each other. And she helped him with his writing, and he helped with her writing, I think. Maybe she didn't let him help him too much. But he was a very well-rounded human being, and he was all business at work. And I don't mean tough or mean, but I mean to the point, concise, laconic in a way, but just let's get this job done because the mission is so important. We need to do it right without doing it self-righteously.
And picking up on that, Robin, I mean, that's really Jim. I mean, Jim gave work his all when he was at work, but he had a very full life outside of television and the NewsHour.
Yeah, we talked a lot back and forth from New York to Washington when we weren't on the air. And mostly we didn't talk about the news. We talked about the books we were writing or hoping to write at the time. Jim is an extraordinarily intelligent man. I think he's the brightest man I ever worked with. And he had not only a penetrating intelligence, but also a moral intelligence. He had a way of cutting through to the moral equation in any situation, political, in terms of friendship, and the kind of man you trusted as I trusted him. I could tell him anything, and did, things I wouldn't tell other people. And he and I had, don't know what secrets he had from me, but I had very few secrets from him, and it was a really remarkable thing. That moral intelligence, it goes to the central part of Jim, which I think is exemplified, and it's pretentious, by the advice that Polonius gives to Laertes in Hamlet: to thine own self be true, thou canst not then be false to any man. And if that isn't a good motto for today, I don't know. And Jim embodied that.
That makes me think, Justice Breyer, thinking about Jim, you know, he's one of those people who could spot a phony a mile away. I mean, he had a kind of a radar in terms of reading what was right and what wasn't. You know, we talked about the Marines and how that mattered in his life. That probably had something to do with it. What about his Kansas roots? I mean, his father was Jim had a love of buses. We talked about that.
Well, he wrote a very good crime novel about somebody who lived in I think it was a train station, wasn't it? Somewhere in Kansas.
Yeah. He also wrote a most moving memoir called We Were Dreamers. Yeah. In fact, his first book after the novel he published, first of all. But We Were Dreamers is an account of his brother and he, with the two parents, running the small feeder bus line in Kansas during the Second World War that connected with the main railway stations. It is all Jim, and it's very honest and very moving. When there was enough money in the ticket box on the bus, they would stop at a restaurant, and his dad would say, "Okay, the sky's the limit." Whenever Jim sat down with us at dinner or with family or with a few couples, Jim would sit down and say, "Okay, the sky's the limit."
That picks up something, because it's hard to communicate how much fun he was to be with.
Yeah.
And it's partly because he was so interested in everything, and he did have a great sense of humor.
And he was surprising in that way. He used to tease me about having left PBS for a while to go to work at one of the cable channels. He would tease me that I had gone to work for the Home Shopping Network.
Yes.
He never let go of that one.
He was
the other side of it.
Judy, he was the best man at when I was married in 1984. And in his toast, he said, "It must be love. Who else would marry a 54-year-old man with braces?"
It isn't just the jokes, but look at how each of us, when we're thinking of him today, is smiling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a sad day, and we're smiling because we're thinking of him and his personality and just the fun of
And
being
for
with him.
all that fun and humor, he had a very serious, with Robin, responsibility.
He did.
And they created the half-hour show, then the hour show, which the stations didn't really think they wanted until we convinced them they needed it. And basically, it was a very important enterprise to run, to lead, and to keep the respect for. So when the day came that he finally decided, I think, to just no longer be on the air, he came over to see me in my office, and I said, "Jim, I'll come to you. I always go to his office. He doesn't come to my office." He said, "No, I'm coming to you." I had no idea what it was about. He said, "Sharon, do you want the NewsHour?" I said, "Yes." This is a 5-second transaction, but I knew what that meant.
That was an important
You're going to
thing.
care about it as much as we do. You're going to put your heart and soul into it. You're going to be an advocate. You're going to be a defender. No matter what goes on, you're going to carry on Robin's and my legacy. He didn't say those words, but that's exactly what he meant.
It mattered.
And I hope I'm doing that.
It mattered so much to him. And there is the legacy. We're talking about the love of life that Jim Lehrer had, but he does leave a profound legacy. The man who moderated more presidential debates, Justice Breyer, than anyone else, 12 debates, who left a legacy of journalism that endures and will endure forever.
I mean, I hope people watch the recordings of those debates.
Yeah.
And they watch how he did it.